Hello, Sean Moran here, and I'm going to be talking about the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates. Socrates had a particular philosophy of education that I think is still relevant today. He was born in 469 BCE, that's before the Common Era, what we used to call BC. His father was Sophronius, a stonemason, but his mother is more interesting. His mother, Phanerete, was a midwife, and he considered himself to be a sort of midwife, but a midwife not for babies, but for knowledge. He was bringing knowledge into the world, just as his mother was bringing babies into the world. But he wasn't bringing his own knowledge into the world. He was helping other people to bring their knowledge into the world. This is called the maieutic method, which I'll come on to in a few minutes. Just like Jesus, who followed 400 years later, Socrates left no writing of his own for us to read. Like Jesus, the only writing he's observed to have done was some scratching in the sand. So for a record of his philosophy, we have to read Plato. Although Socrates is widely considered to have been one of the greatest teachers in the world, he said he wasn't a teacher. Unlike his rivals, the sophists, he didn't talk at any length on any topic to show his wisdom. In fact, he claimed not to have any ideas of his own. Now, there might be an element of irony in that. He was a clever guy, but he pretended not to know anything. So this can be a useful posture sometimes for a teacher, to pretend you don't know and ask the student to tell you what they think. He described himself as a barren midwife. This was the tradition in ancient Greece, that once women were past their childbearing years, that they could become midwives. So his method is called the maieutic method. The ancient Greek for a midwife is maieutikos. So the maieutic method means a method based on childbirth, a method based on midwifery. Dialogue is at the heart of this. The Socratic technique involves the student and the teacher entering into a dialogue to explore their knowledge. Typically, once the student had given an idea, Socrates would put it to the test. This process is called elenchus. The word elenchus, it actually relates to the Greek for shame. So the idea is that in the dialogue, the student would shamefacedly realize that he or she, the student, would realize, hold on a minute, I'm mistaken, this isn't right. And that's the point at which new knowledge can come into the world. So this process of disputation, of elenchus, as the Greeks called it then, which relates to shame. So, for example, Socrates has a conversation with a famous general, and he shows the famous general that the general, in fact, didn't know what courage meant. So Socrates would ask the general, what is courage? And the general would have his definition, and Socrates would examine this definition and show that it was mistaken in some way. So the general would try again. Or he would ask somebody about piety. What does it mean to be pious? And the person would say, and the conversation would go on, and eventually the person would realize, in the case of the general, I don't know what courage really means. And he'd go off in a tantrum. And same with the person with piety. He didn't know what piety really meant, so off he would stomp. This actually didn't do Socrates any good in the long run, as we shall see. It was a destructive activity in some ways because it left the students deflated. It left the students realizing they didn't know what they thought they knew. Now, Socrates thought that this was doing the person a great favour by showing him that his knowledge was actually not knowledge at all. It can be seen as a form of learning to get rid of false opinions. Much better to dispense with these and replace them with genuine knowledge. Now, although Socrates in some of his dialogues could be a little bit brutal to the students in dismissing their false opinions, he did show a little bit of concern. I mean, for example, in Theaetetus, which is one of his dialogues, it's a book by Plato, in one of his dialogues, Theaetetus, he's talking to a teenage boy, and he uses this midwife analogy again. Theaetetus says, I cannot shake off a feeling of anxiety. And Socrates says, these are the pangs of labour, my dear Theaetetus. You have something within you which you are bringing to the birth. So here we see this midwife analogy in action. But once this idea is born, Socrates isn't exactly nurturing. He wants to test this baby and make sure it's fit to live. And they were quite brutal about these things in ancient Greek days. So he says, "Then this is the child, however he may turn out, which you and I have brought into the world. And now that he is born, we must run around the hearth with him and see whether he is worth rearing or is only a wind egg," that's a phantom pregnancy, "and a sham. Is he to be reared in any case and not exposed? Or will you bear to see him rejected and not get into a passion if I take away your firstborn?" Now, this is where it becomes quite abhorrent, really, to our way of thinking today. Exposing was a custom they had in ancient times. They'd leave a baby outdoors. Now, they didn't consider it exactly murder. Put the baby outside. Maybe somebody will pick up the baby and adopt it. We see cases in the Bible of this. The baby Moses was left in a river in a basket made of bulrushes. And the Pharaoh's daughter adopted him, and he grew up to be a great prophet who led the Hebrews out of slavery. In ancient Greek mythology, we have Oedipus as well. He was exposed, but he was adopted and ended up killing his father and marrying his mother without realizing who they were. So there's a long tradition of this exposing. That's what Socrates means when he talks about exposing. So Socrates saw an apparently negative result, the demonstration that the student did not know anything, the baby failed the sort of postnatal tests, as valuable in its own right. So a negative result, finding out you don't know something, is just as valuable as learning something. And also his insight that education could consist in drawing out knowledge from the student. We have the Latin word educare, which means to draw out. He didn't speak Latin, of course, he spoke Greek, but the principle is the same. This idea that the maieutic method involves drawing out knowledge from the student, not trying to cram knowledge into the student, but to draw it out from them, and then put it to the test, have a dialogue about it. One famous example of his teaching methods involved a slave boy from the household of a Greek nobleman called Meno. The book in which you can read about this is called The Meno, M-E-N-O. By skillful questioning and the drawing of diagrams in the sand with his stick, Socrates enabled this boy, the slave boy, who was not educated, to derive Pythagoras' theorem from first principles. You remember Pythagoras' theorem about the square and the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle? Well, essentially, that's what Socrates deals with, and the slave boy who didn't know anything about maths managed to derive it. So this is called the Socratic method. By skillful questioning, we can draw knowledge out of students. Now, if you actually read the Meno, he's doing a little bit more than drawing knowledge out. He is actually asking some very leading questions, and the slave boy only has to say, "Yes, Socrates." So it's not quite all that it's made out to be, I don't think. Socrates, by using these techniques, was out of step with an influential group of teachers who were called the sophists. Now, the sophists were professional teachers. They charged large fees so they wouldn't be talking to a slave boy, and they became rich and famous. But they did claim to teach things. They weren't interested in drawing knowledge out. They would tell you things, and you had to learn them. They for example, said that they could teach virtue. They could provide you with some prepackaged knowledge and guaranteed techniques of argument and speech making that you just had to copy, learn off to be successful. That's all you had to do. Now, Socrates rejected this sort of formulaic teaching. He rambled around the city, conducting random conversations with people he met outside the law courts, in the market, or at drunken parties. Bit of a character was our Socrates. So you might think how that applies in the modern world. Are we the sophists? Are we providing prepackaged knowledge that all the student has to do is not understand it, but just learn it off, and they'll be rich and successful? Think about that. Now, of course, this got him into trouble. You couldn't go on like that. Annoying so many people and get away with it. He annoyed famous generals, random people in the street, people who claimed to be pious, priestly kind of people. So this got him into trouble. He alienated a lot of people. So at the age of 70, in 399 BCE, he was arrested. He was taken before the courts. He was charged on trumped-up charges of not honouring the city's gods believing in false gods and corrupting the youth of Athens. Socrates didn't play the game. He could have said the right things in court, apologized. He would have been okay. He wouldn't do it. He wouldn't play the legalistic games. He wouldn't ask for the mercy of the court. Instead, he said that the city of Athens should be grateful to him for forcing people to examine their lives. He said he was like a gadfly stinging a lazy horse into action. As you might expect, this strategy didn't work. A jury of 500 citizens found him guilty. A verdict of 280 to 220. We know this because Plato was in court. Plato, the philosopher, was there in court and wrote this down and published it in his book. So the court said to him, well, what sentence would you suggest? Now, if Socrates had said, exile from Athens, if you send me away from Athens, that will be punishment enough. He didn't. He demanded free meals for life. He wanted a pension as a reward for his services. So the court sentenced him to death. Now, the method of execution was to be drinking a poison called hemlock, made from plants. As it happened, there was a religious festival starting the day after the verdict, so the executioner would be on holiday and they couldn't execute him straight away. So, more or less, he was being invited to get out of Athens, and his friends said, come on, let's go, let's go. He could have escaped, but he wouldn't. He said, no, I've been in Athens all my life. Athens has been good to me. I'm going to die here. So he did. When the executioner came, he took the poison, and surrounded by his friends, he expired, thinking he was going to a better place. On the painting, we can see he's pointing upwards. This is a famous painting called The Death of Socrates by Jacques-Louis David, the French artist. It was painted in 1787, long after, of course, these events happened. But the point is, he's pointing upwards. He believed in a better place than the earth, and he was going there to the land of the forms. So that was Socrates. Inspiring teacher in some ways, unconventional, didn't play the game, but it ended badly for him in the end. Perhaps the mistake we could avoid is alienating too many people. I think some of his cheeky techniques of getting people to question their views are good. Socratic techniques are good. You don't want to be upsetting too many people, though. I have a tendency to do that sometimes because it can rebound on you eventually, and you can be forced to drink the hemlock.